Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and we're going to be talking about protecting yourself as a clinician. So, in the first chapter, the first part of the Burton book, we look at protecting the client, and it's protecting the client from bias, from harm, making sure that we know the rules and laws of confidentiality, etc. But we also have to protect ourselves, and part of that is through our record keeping, which protects both ourselves and the client. But then there are other things that we can do to protect ourselves as well. So remember that we're not always working with the most stable of people. An addiction can make people very, very desperate. And one of the reasons why we have to be very careful with our clinical record keeping is to make sure that we can dispute things. If a person is in active addiction or they're not ready to make changes and it's between them lying to you or to somebody else about you and going to prison, they're probably going to lie. It's self-preservation. So we have to make sure that our documentation is all up to code, that we are following our personal and professional ethics as well. Okay. In addition to protecting the client through ethical practices, a counselor must protect themselves from liability and malpractice as well as emotional burnout. Okay. In record keeping, we protect our clinical information. We look at self-disclosure. So the general rule of thumb with self-disclosure is to use it with discretion. And our clients are not there for ourselves. We are there for the clients. They should not be your counselor. So in group, a self-disclosure might be Demi Lovato, I have noticed that you have really opened up the past couple of sessions and that you are more open to what the group has to say, and I'm really glad that you are at that part. Okay, that's self-disclosure. You're just disclosing your personal feelings about your client's progress. Okay. Another example of this that Burton addresses, I think in a brilliant manner, is the whole, do you self-disclose if you're in recovery or if you're not in recovery? And that's a personal decision that you have to make. Clients might be biased towards you in either direction. Okay, this is the only field where self-disclosure status is sometimes put at higher than our education. And the example that a dean of mine had said, and that I like to say is, do you go to the cancer doctor and say, cancer doctor, have you had cancer before? And the doctor says no. Well, I don't think you know enough about cancer, and I don't feel comfortable with you treating me because you haven't had cancer. How ridiculous is that? So why do we allow this to happen in chemical dependency? Right? What you can do here is parlay it into a discussion with the client's values. You could say, Dr. Hausinger, are you in recovery? And I could say, well, Miss Lovato, that's something that I keep private to myself for several different reasons, and I'm wondering what your values are about that and why that is important or not important to you. Okay. Now, some people might automatically say, well, that means you're not. And you can say no. And then you have to have the privacy discussion with them, because when you're in addiction, it's not private. All your messiness is out on the table. And a lot of people have never had the luxury of having their boundaries, I guess it is a luxury, of having their boundaries protected. And so it's really important that you model this. Like, you don't have to tell people things that you don't want to tell them, and that's okay. And then I like to parlay that discussion into the different roles. So you have a counselor who helps you get to the roots of the issues, the case management side of that, which is we help link you with resources. The counselor and the case manager are often the same person. And then you have the peer support, and the peer support person is designed to mentor you and help you, especially if you're going through 12-step, because they've been there before. That shouldn't be the counselor. That's not their job. And so I use that as an opportunity to do that. Right? So if someone says, well, I don't know if you can help me if you don't tell me, and we have a discussion about privacy, and then I give the cancer doctor option. And then we talk about the purpose of counseling is this, and this is what I'm going to offer. The purpose of sober support is this, and this is why we ask you to go. Okay. So that's a personal decision that you have to make. Most recently, I had an old school counselor a bachelor's level counselor asked me if I was in recovery, and she was really biased about that, and I felt incredibly uncomfortable um, about that. And you might get that on interviews and see what the policy is for that. But we don't owe it to our clients to tell them personal things about ourselves. And some of the most ethical counselors there are don't have their own treatment histories, and that's okay. Just think about how far-reaching addiction is. Um, we know about addiction with family members and people that we love, and we become experts on that. Doesn't mean that you have to go through the addiction yourself. If you think about a family member that's had diabetes or cancer or something, you probably know as much, if not more, than they do, and you know how to give support. Okay, so that's a myth, and we need to fix that. And you might hear people being called normies, if they're, I joke about it, but it actually can be quite damaging. Um, so in the old days, you didn't have to go through any schooling in order to be a substance use disorder professional. You just had to go through AA. And I think that's really why we have a lot of the ethical issues. And we still kind of have this rift in the field, and we're waiting for that paradigm to change. And it is changing. Okay. Supervision can be in many different forms. And it doesn't have to be, it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be part of your professional development plan. It can also be weekly staffings, right? Setting up your goals. Like, hey, I'm really, really unsure about this client. What do I do, right? Okay. We have professional development requirements. So in the state of Washington, if you are a substance use disorder professional, every 2 years after you are fully credentialed, every 2 years you have to show that you have 40 hours or more of continuing education units. And on the CD website, it tells you exactly what that looks like. And then staying curious. And if there's a topic that's really of interest to you, there's all types of free webinars. You can usually get scholarships to go to different types of workshops, and your agency will maybe pay for you to go to some of those too. Okay, so we're going to look at dual relationships. What are the pros and cons of dual relationships? Well, a dual relationship is having more than one relationship. Okay, this is our definition. The Ethics Code of the American Psychological Association offers a clear definition of multiple role relationships. Multiple role relationships occur when a therapist already has a professional role with a person and is also in another role with the same person, or is also in a relationship with someone closely associated with or related to the person with whom the therapist has the professional relationship, or makes promises to enter into another relationship in the future with the person or a person closely associated with or related to the person. So, for example, a teacher who is also a sports coach. Okay. Now, they might be unavailable, especially in small communities. They might encourage people who are reluctant to services to engage, because you're not a scary person, you're somebody they know. Usually community-based, and we see social justice advocacy having these roles. Cons, they might be unavoidable. It could make blurred boundaries more present. Both of you, counselor and patient, client, might have more risk of being taken advantage of, and they could be considered messy. Okay. All right. And we're going to look at that a little bit later on, too. Okay. In some cases, you might need to excuse yourself. And in other cases, you might be the best person for the job. For example, super awkward Dr. Hausinger's story. Many years ago, I was at an outpatient center as a counselor, and I got called into the office, and they're like, your new client who was assigned to you is dating your ex-boyfriend. I was like, okay. So she looks at me and she's like, I can be professional about it if you can. And she had to go to another group because first of all, I'd never met her before, and I didn't know what she looked like or who she was. I knew what her name was. I knew a lot about her partner. I knew a lot about what was going on that I shouldn't have because I had prior knowledge. And I could have been very biased about it. So the best thing for this person was to go to a different group. Okay. All right. Another story. As you know, I'm a musician, and this is when I was a housing case manager, and it wasn't uncommon for us to have to transport clients in our personal vehicles in order to sign leases. And I had a client, and we were listening to music, and he said, "Oh, I have a friend who's in this band." Well, guess what? His friend was my friend, and I knew a lot of people in that band, and so I disclosed to my boss. And my boss said, "I'm not concerned about you. I just want to make sure that your client doesn't take advantage of you." And so my client disclosed to our third party friend. Now, it would have been unethical and illegal for me to out the client, but the client outed himself to our friend. And then our friend took it upon herself to, our friend took it upon himself to mediate between us. And so he would say, "Well, she's going to come out tonight to hear the band play, so you can't," and vice versa. The only time that it crossed a boundary was when my friend texted me and said, "Hey, you don't have to go to your appointment. I picked up your client. We're going to the soccer match." And I'm like, you can't do that because now he's missed a meeting with me and I have to write him up. So please don't do that again. But that was the way that it was handled. Okay? And that was perfectly ethical. So you have to document everything, let your supervisor know, etc. Okay. Can be really awkward until you sort it out. And you just have to have the conversation like, we have mutual people in common. So if I see you outside, I can't come up to you, etc. Right. Okay. So something really important, clinician burnout. We have some things that contribute. And if you are on Facebook, there's a doctor that I encourage you to look at. He does musical parodies, but Dr. Z-Dog, he talks about burnout and moral injury. And he says a lot of times what we consider to be burnout is actual moral injury, where we're forced to work in systems that we don't agree with. For example, doctors and nurses having to work within the constraints of bureaucracy and insurance and not being able to provide the care that they need or want to. It's insulting to our personal morality. And it's not burnout, it's moral injury, which is really interesting. So helper decay and helper fatigue are related to each other. So if you think about fatigue, being tired, being restless, just feeling like you can't rest or get a break, decay is where we start to kind of crumble. Maybe our morals slip a little bit, or we're sloppier than we should be, and then that maybe we're done. Right? Boundary crossing versus boundary violation, really important. Okay, so boundary crossing is defined as something that is generally seen as helpful to the client. So, for example, you have a client that I said this in the last lecture. The client needs bus fare in order to get to their visitation. They don't have money. If they don't get to the visitation, they might get penalized by CPS and might not be able to get their kids back. You give them $3. It's a boundary crossing. It benefits the clients. It doesn't really hurt you. Now, the downside is you don't want word to get out because people will take advantage of that, and you'd have to say, this is a one-time thing. This is what we're doing. I'm making a personal ethical decision that may or may not be endorsed by the agency. Okay. A boundary violation, on the other hand, is not helpful to the client. It is a gross departure from the reasonable standards of practice. An easy example of this is having romantic and sexual relationships with your clients. Just don't do it. The number one rule of law and ethics is don't have sex with your clients, followed by do no harm. They're basically the same thing. And you might be laughing and you might think it's silly, but I have to say it because it does happen, and I've seen it lead to relapse. Many years ago, I had a poor client who ended up an inpatient because his counselor led him on, and he thought that she wanted a romantic relationship with him, when in reality he had a pickup truck and she wanted him to move her apartment. And she had a boyfriend, and the guy broke his nose, and he ended up he ended up relapsing on his drug of choice. And we had to have a talk like, okay, this is not your fault. This is the counselor's fault, and how do we go about reporting this? Okay. The slippery slope phenomenon can apply to both of these. So we usually just don't go to like having sex with our clients. I want you to definitely check out the vignettes in your Burton book. But doing seemingly benign things like giving clients money, or if you're a smoker, giving people cigarettes, or bringing them food, or giving them rides here and there. Small things can add up to big things, okay? Which makes it easier to fudge the lines later on. So you just have to be very careful and self-aware of these things. Okay. There are 6 main causes of burnout: weariness, bleeding the personal into the professional, or taking things home with you, just not feeling it anymore. And that's okay. I think a lot of people stay in the field longer or kind of ignore this because they feel like a bad person. Like, well, I used to love to do this, and I feel like I should, and I should like to do this because it's needed in the world. Don't let it compromise your health, okay? You're not less of a person by wanting to change jobs or careers or find a different way to do that. Very important. You have to give yourself permission to feel these feelings. Sometimes we're under challenged and you can be really overwhelmed and bored at the same time. And sometimes workers are exploited. Early on in my career, I didn't have very good boundaries and I was afraid of my employers, and I would stay at work till 1 o'clock in the morning doing paperwork because I was afraid of them. And that's not okay. They used fear and intimidation to get young people like myself at the time to do that. Okay. We don't want to slip on our S steps: sleep, diet, exercise, and pleasure support. Pleasure and support. Okay. Self-care. A lot of agencies will preach, oh, self-care, 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 but they won't give you the ability to do that, and that's not okay. If you're looking for a job and you see that the ads are being posted every 3 months or so and it's the same position, that's a bad warning sign that they have high turnover rate. Being poorly supervised. And then there might also be an ethical issue too. Like if you have a master's degree or a PhD, should you be being supervised by somebody with an associate's level, or maybe not a degree at all, that's been in the field for 20 or 30 years? And people have different opinions on that. Okay. Red flag alerts, and this is directly from the Kutcher and Spiegel. Actively seeking opportunities to spend time with a client outside of a professional setting. Anticipating with uncommon excitement a certain client's appointment. Expecting that certain clients should volunteer to do favors for you. Viewing a client as in a position to advance your own position and fantasizing as to how that would play out. Wishing that a client were not a client and instead some other type of relationship like your friend or business partner. Disclosing considerable detail about your own life to a client and expecting interest or nurturing in return. Trying to influence a client's hobbies, political or religious views, or other personal choices that have no direct therapeutic relevance. Allowing a client to take undue advantage without confronting him or her. For example, allowing many missed appointments without calling to cancel just because you like them. Relying on a client's presence or praise to boost how you feel about yourself. Giving into a client's requests and perspectives on issues from fear that he or she will otherwise leave therapy, and feeling entitled to all the credit when a client improves. These are red flag alerts that you're getting too attached, and blending boundaries. Okay. Viewing one or more clients as among the central people in your life. Greatly resisting terminating a client despite indicators that termination would be appropriate. Termination, well, it doesn't mean killing our clients. It means that maybe they finished the course of their therapy, but you like them and you don't want them to leave. That's called fostering client dependence. Okay. Sometimes people do that for money, which is not good either. Believing that you are the only person who can help them. Noticing that the pattern of interactions with the client is becoming increasingly irrelevant to your therapeutic goals, like talking about things that are off topic. Feeling jealous or envious of a client's other close relationships. Frequently allowing the therapy session to go over time. Instigating communications with the client in between sessions for reasons that are contrived or irrelevant to the therapy issues. Finding yourself making extra efforts to impress a client about yourself and your achievements. A feeling of dread upon sensing that a client may decide to leave therapy. And finally, feeling uncomfortable discussing the red flags that pertain to you with a trust colleague because you're concerned that the colleague would be critical of your thinking or behavior. Okay. So I want you to think about these dilemmas. You're a counselor in recovery and are at a self-help meeting. You see a client at a meeting. What do? You are a social worker counselor. You are at the grocery store. You see a client. What do? You realize that a client of yours has a mutual friend in common. What do? Okay, So in ethical decision making, we have to follow up. Well, you can follow a process, but I want you to think about some of these options. Which option do you think is the most ethical decision and why? Which option do you think is the least ethical decision and why? Is there an option that has not yet been considered, and which option would you select and why? Okay, so there's a couple ethical dilemmas here. You had the Billy one, okay, as a review. Ethical dilemma 2, Oksana is seeking abortion counseling from a practitioner who has been actively involved in the pro-life movement. The therapist has extreme discomfort with Oksana's values and doesn't think he could maintain objectivity. It would be best if he, and then there's the 4 answer choices there, and I want you to think about which one you would do. And number 3, Tanya seems to meet some of her personal needs through counseling her clients. And then find the answer.